I think a common experience for many Fire Emblem players is using a certain unit as the leading force in their playthrough, demolishing enemies left and right, only to discover that other players consider said unit to be bad. I've also observed a lot of great analysis on how units can achieve high levels of performance with minimal effort, but even this isn't always considered to mean a unit is good. Killing everything certainly seems good, so how could this not be good enough? From what I've seen in the community, this is because comparative evaluations are frequently used to determine whether a unit can actually be considered good. This has resulted in many units being labeled as bad, but I'd argue this is both inconsistent with the inherent meaning of bad and contradicts the sentiment that most units are viable. To get to the heart of the issue though, I think we should take a nice long look back at some basic English grammar. Yay! Now, I'm no English professor, but I'd like to think I'm competent enough to explain the difference between positive, comparative, and superlative adjectives. An adjective is a word that describes a noun, which in our Fire Emblem context is unit. A positive adjective is like the base adjective, where we're just describing one noun in of itself. For our first example, let's use the adjective fast. We can say Lyn is a fast unit because she has the speed stat to double many enemies in Blazing Blade. A comparative adjective, then, is describing a noun in relation to another noun. Eliwood is faster than Hector because his speed stat is higher, or because Eliwood doubles more enemies than Hector. Lastly, a superlative adjective is describing a noun in relation to multiple other nouns. Lyn is the fastest lord in Blazing Blade because she has the highest speed of the three lords. You'll note that even in this pretty straightforward example, there's still some room for argumentation, depending on how we interpret the base adjective. Do we take into account constitution and what a unit's effective attack speed is, or do we just look at the raw speed stats? Do we assume units are at the same level, or do we assume what levels units are expected to be at when making the comparison? If these terms are established, then making comparisons sounds fair enough, but the situation only gets more complicated once we start looking at some more ambiguous terms. Which brings me to our word of the day, good. As far as I'm aware, good is a positive adjective, which is used to describe the quality of one noun. The question stands though, what are we judging a unit to be good at? The variation of criteria that players use is its own topic, so for the sake of our discussion, I'll be sticking with one context that I think best takes into account what I've seen commonly used in the community: making the game easy. A unit is good if they contribute towards an easy playthrough, a unit is better than another unit if their contributions contribute towards an easier playthrough, and the best units contribute towards the easiest playthrough. This takes into account both the strength of a unit's contribution, in judging how they relate to the difficulty of a playthrough, as well as availability, in judging how long they contribute. In this context, the positive good is sounding pretty similar to viable. Different players may also have different definitions for this term, but I believe viable is most commonly understood to describe units that the player can use while having an easy time playing the game. More viable units can be used to make the game easier, and the most viable units are what make the game the easiest. In this regard, most viable sounds exactly like what many players mean by optimal. Putting aside that there's a lot of subjectivity in the difficulty that each player may experience, I think there are some crossed wires when it comes to this table. Most notably, being the positive, viable, or even good isn't actually considered to be enough for many players to identify a unit as good. Rather, they must be considered comparatively better than other similar units, or even the superlative best. One type of argument in favor of this is, why would I bother using X unit when Y unit does the same thing but better? There is no reason to use them, therefore they must not be good. If we're just looking at the positive, good, and viable though, then the comparisons to other units shouldn't matter. Rather, we're judging a unit by their own merits to be simply good. I actually think many players are in agreement that most Fire Emblem units, especially in the modern games, are viable, in that you can use them and have an easy enough time. But this hasn't stopped players from evaluating them as bad, trash, or a variety of other strongly worded adjectives. Another argument in favor of using comparisons to determine the positive good is that of opportunity cost. Fire Emblem makes the player choose units with limited deployment slots and resources. If you choose to invest in X unit, then they may perform decently, but you are depriving yourself of other units being strong enough to make a playthrough easy. A good unit must have a place in an easy playthrough, therefore X units cannot be a good unit. However, given the massive amounts of aspects that determine a playthrough's difficulty past the usage of just one unit, I can hardly think of any cases where units could be considered bad by this logic. My best guess would be, I don't know, Donald from Awakening, if we're running under the assumption that an easy Lunatic Plus playthrough has to involve Robin getting the early second seal to snowball and get Nosferatu access. Regardless, I don't actually think this is what most players mean, who are instead, again, applying comparative logic to a positive standalone evaluation. Now, I don't blame players for wanting to use comparative logic. After all, if we truly were just looking to determine whether units are a positive, good, or viable, then I think the answer would be pretty simple. Every unit is good, provided you, know how to play the game. There are only a handful of units in the entire series that I could see a genuine argument for being unviable, like Binding Blade Sophia, because of the extensive amounts of chapters that even the most experienced players might find actively difficult when training her. I do think there's interesting discussion to be had when asking how viable is a unit, but asking who is more viable or better still has its merits. If we're making comparisons, we get to look at traits that are specifically unique to each unit, and then speculate which of these traits have either higher values or are to be valued higher. For example, Lyn has higher speed than Hector, therefore Lyn is faster than Hector. However, Hector's higher strength and axe access lets him deal more damage to enemies despite not doubling. This means Hector's higher attack is more valuable than Lyn's higher speed, therefore Hector is better than Lyn. These are all interesting observations, but I'll remind us that this doesn't actually tell us whether Lyn is a bad unit, or Hector is a good unit, in of themselves, just that Hector is considered comparatively better. And of course, this is assuming that we're using a specific metric to say what a unit is being better at, and that all players have the same understanding of that metric when making their arguments. That, however, is a topic for another day. My main takeaway for now is that better doesn't necessarily mean good, nor does worse mean bad. I know it might sound like I'm being a bit harsh on our choice of language here, but I think communication is extremely important. Discussions about strategy can be very interesting, but they do create an environment where one's logic can be called into question, and I'd at least like to be sure any disagreements are actually due to logic, and not just a miscommunication of terms. If you made it this far, thank you for watching, and hopefully you were able to take away something, as simple of a topic it may seem. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.